Hello, everybody. How are we doing? Let's get our textbooks together. Let's get our Mary Oliver. I don't know if yours is as beat up and well-loved as mine, but you've got yours. And the Kuser book. I want to talk about a bunch of things with you. I'm ready to go. I got a bow tie. I am ready to discuss some things. And I want to talk about titles and first impressions. I want to talk a bit about different kinds of forms, talk a little bit about free verse. We've got all sorts of things that we've got on the agenda for today. And I want to begin with first impressions. There's another video I'm going to be posting up today that is about titles. And so I think that this kind of relates. So we'll talk about titles because you've already thought about them. Let's make sure you've got your textbooks in hand. I call them textbooks. They're not. They're books. Get your books in hand so we can discuss this. And we start off here with Kuser on page 25 really, talking about the first impressions that we make in a poem. And I in the other video, I have called, I don't know the order you're watching these, but in that video, I call the first line and titles as sort of an argument in which you are presenting a series of statements to your reader that will hopefully compel them to keep going. Kuser is a kinder, gentler way of talking about it when he discusses it as a representation of the hand you extend in friendship towards your reader. That's a nice way of thinking about it. It's something comforting, potentially, unless it isn't, that you're extending to your reader. Although I still think we can look at it as a way of trying to convince your reader to keep reading more. Maybe if we feel more comforted, if we feel like there's the hand of friendship being extended, maybe that's going to make it easier for us to feel like we can accept that hand and want to get in. They're the first exposure that he or she has to your poem, as Kuser tells us, and you want to make a good impression. You also want to swiftly and gracefully draw your reader in. And he then uses the example of some pretend lines from a poem. It's called A Winter Night, and here's what he writes. It was the 15th of December, snowing, and I was in Oshkosh, Wisconsin when I... ... Does that grab us? By the way that Kuser's setting up, it's not supposed to, right? Why doesn't it grab us? Because it's feeling functional in a way that isn't particularly engaging. We always talk about wanting to grab a reader at the beginning. Or if we use Kuser's more gentle language, we want to comfort a reader that it's going to be okay. We want to be friends with the reader and extend them in. But these lines aren't doing any of that. It's setting up a plot, a setting, I guess, essentially. And so we said that the poet Leonard Nathan, who taught me a great deal during our correspondence, would suggest, Ted, we don't care whether it was the 15th month of the month or the 18th, for one thing, but for another, why don't you put all that information, that exposition, into the title? Make it A Snowy Night in Oshkosh, and then get on with the poem. We're out here waiting for something to happen. That's interesting, right? That we're out here waiting for something to happen. And if you're spending too much time setting up the date and the time, then I can't really get to something happening. And we've looked at poems that have titles that are doing that functional work. It was Refrigerator, 1957, was the name of the first poem that we looked at, that we wrote our imitations of. That's the title. It could have been something more poetic, but it was working as function. It was working to draw us in. And Kuser goes on about how important that was for him to have that advice. He says that the idea that exposition should be loaded into titles rather than taking up space in the poem is some of the best advice he's ever given me. And he's given me a lot. This is one way of doing it. And there are many, many ways of doing it. And in the other video I made for you this morning, we're going to look at a variety of different titles and kind of hear how they all function. And some of them maybe are loading exposition into the top of the poem in the title, as we've talked about. But some don't. But it's important to see that title as a way of entering into the poem. It is not necessarily the poem itself, although some writers do that, right? We'll see some writers who will begin with a line in the title that will ease into the first line of the poem itself. Sometimes we come across that, and that's okay. But he's saying that there's an opportunity to sort of load in the setting, the exposition, so that it's not taking up time in the poem. So the poem is able to get to other things. And that's interesting advice. Again, there are always exceptions in which that'll work, and there are always places in which maybe something else would work better. So it's a matter of figuring out ways that you can do it. And throughout this section, you will have a lot of discussions of titles and opening lines that do different things. He presents the title "And I Raise My Hand in Return" on page 26 from a Joseph Stroud poem. And he says that this title describes the poet's response to the events in the poem itself, suggesting his astonishment when he caught himself raising his hand in greeting, though he might rather have turned away. The title is, in a sense, the conclusion of the poem. So sometimes the title can work in response to the poem. Sometimes it can feel very detached from the poem. Sometimes it will help us understand the poem in a new way. If I can be self-serving enough to talk about a series of poems that I've been working on for a while, I have a series of poems in which they don't have any titles, but there are a series of like words that are more abstractions than specifics. So I ask the reader in these poems to randomly pick a word and then attach it to the poem. So maybe the title that the reader comes up with is intimacy. And then you go back and read the poem, and it's going to be a short poem that'll have a very specific kind of image. And then that title is going to influence the poem itself to kind of make us feel a different way based on what that title is. It's a little gimmicky what I'm doing, but it's a way of sort of thinking about how a title can really influence the way that we do it. It's a fun exercise, actually. Take a really specific image-based poem, a poem that is about a very specific thing, and then give it a title that's kind of vague, and see how those two things correspond with each other. Maybe they push each other back. Maybe there's a very logical connection. Maybe there's a whole new dynamic you learn about the poem you wrote because of that title. It's an interesting thing to play around with. One thing I like to warn us about and be careful about is I don't love titles, and I think that I'm not alone on this, that do too much to anticipate what the poem is going to do. And now what I mean by that is I want us to avoid poems that end, poem titles, that are the last line or a variation of the last line. I mean, there are ways in which that could work, because there are ways anything could work. But I always like to feel a joy of surprise as I go through a poem, that I want to feel like something is happening that I'm not expecting. And again, different poems do different things, but I think that it's, to me, almost universal that I want to be surprised line to line in a poem, that I don't necessarily want to anticipate where a thing is going. And if I feel like the title has already pretty much told me where things will wrap up, often I feel disappointed. Is that something unique to me? Maybe. But I think that we should have a poem that continues to surprise, and a title that does work to the poem, but not to spoil it for us, for lack of a better term. So I think that I've already talked about titles in the other video. We don't need to go into great detail here, but I think it's interesting to think about his way of presenting it. This is my first exposure to a poem, is the title. This is the first chance I have to learn something of a poem. Let's make sure that the reader gets something that makes them want more. And then that's where the opening lines come in as well. And I think that there's some interesting things that we could do here too. And he talks about personal stories. One of the things I love about the book is when he talks about readings that he's gone to and nights out with his wife and things like that. It feels like we're getting to talk about, we're getting to listen to somebody who's really wise and has interesting things to share. But he says this at the bottom of 27. Opening lines are expectations and possibilities. Expectations and possibilities. It's setting up what we can do in a poem, but it's also giving us a sense of what could happen in the poem. For example, if a poem begins with 3 lines of strict iambic pentameter, a reader will be disconcerted that forceful rhyme is abandoned in the 4th line. If you rhyme the first stanza of the poem, the reader will wonder why you didn't rhyme the 2nd or the 3rd. Are you allowed to do that? You're allowed to do anything. It's poetry. But be aware that if you set up expectations and then do something else, that the reader might be, if confused isn't the right word, not quite sure how to move forward with what's going on. You can set up the most preposterous event or peculiar situation in the opening couple of lines at the top of 28, like the appearance of a ghost. And there's a very good chance your reader will buy right into it. But you can't wait too long. I'm talking about that business of the willing suspension of disbelief that you may remember from lit classes. So when we're in a poem, we're willing to buy things that might not be bought in normal conversation. We've talked about this in terms of that second language of poetry that I've talked about too, that there are things that I'll buy in a poem, both language-wise and maybe content-wise, that I wouldn't buy in a normal circumstance because it's a poem. and because I expect different things. But as he said, you can't wait too long. If you wait too long to put that in there, then the poem might have already allowed the reader to make up their mind on what's going to happen. And so the things you'll try won't have the same effect. So you need to be careful about that. Many different good examples of poems that have good effective opening lines. I think what a good opening line should do is make me feel like I want to read the next line. And how do you do that? You do it with something that is sharp, with something that's interesting, with something that is compelling, but maybe you don't do it with something that is so good that the rest of the poem can't live up to it. And he warns us about that also on page 30. If we overload the opening lines, if we spend so much effort on our opening lines that sometimes they turn out to be the best part of the poem, we polish and polish and polish them till the rest of the poem feels weak by contrast. This is not advisable when it comes to the principles of organization, because good arguments, to use the rhetorical term, build towards strength, towards strong conclusions. So we want our opening lines to be good, but we want our entire poems to be good. So I think there are times in which you'll read something and you'll think, oh gosh, this person put so much work into this part, this beginning, or this ending. But we don't necessarily feel like the rest of the poem is living up to that. And it all has to fit together. Remember, that's one of the things we talked about on the opening night of class, that a poem can be about anything. James Tate told us this. A poem can be about anything, but the things that seem to be important is that all the parts fit together and are in service of each other. So if you end up with a poem that has a really great opening couple of lines and then the rest of it isn't any good, then it's hard to really feel as connected to anything else. This makes sense, right? Have you ever read a book that you were just so gripped by the beginning and then the rest of it just was living in comparisons to the rest of it, and you didn't like it that much because, my gosh, that beginning was so good. This happens in movies sometimes. Sometimes I'll watch the beginning of a movie and it's so good it hurts. And then the movie continues. It's like, man, I wish they would bottle that first 10 minutes and give me that the rest of the way, because the rest of this movie has not led up to that at all. So I think his warning here is a good one. And he suggests that we could revise turning the poem upside down. Put the last lines first just to see if that improves it. This is a thing that we've talked about a lot, is how we can move a poem around. Maybe you take something that's in the middle and you move it to the top and you see what happens. Poems are beautifully designed for us to move them around as much as we want. And I think we should. Don't ever feel like a poem is absolutely set up the way that it is the first draft. Because it might not be. Maybe it is, but it might not be. You might end up doing a lot of things that dramatically shift the way we view that poem, the way we look at that poem. And so it's important for you to be willing to make those changes and move things around. Let's make sure we do, right? The speaker or presence, we've talked about this a little bit, that he introduces on page 30, which is the fact that there is a speaker to a poem. Even if a poem does not have a direct I, there is a speaker in the poem. There has to be, right? There's somebody saying something, so somebody has to be saying it. So even if we don't have an I, don't assume that there isn't a speaker. Don't assume that there isn't a presence, to use the word that Kuser's using in this book. There is a presence. The poet's presentation of a speaker is often referred to as a voice. The voice being that the person we not only hear, but we intuit to be behind the words. Personality, character, humor, wit, garrulousness, reticence, all those and more can be part of voice. But I prefer to call it presence. Kuser's words, not mine. I talk about voice a lot in my work. The presence in and of a poem has a lot to do with the way a reader is affected. For example, a presence with personal charm is a lot more likely to engage a reader than a presence who sneers at his audience, or who seems mean, or arrogant, or self-pitying. So think about the voice that you want to present in the poems, the presence, to use Kuser's word, that you want to get across in the poem. How is it that you want to feel like you're responding to the content and the work that you're providing? How do you want to feel like you're responding to the audience? I can speak from my own experience. I try to present a presence or a voice that is funny and engaging, and it maybe reflects my desperate attempt to be liked. and to be liked by the people that read my poems. Not all of my poems necessarily fit that description, but my poems are often described as being very voice-driven, meaning you can tell the speaker who's behind them and is pushing that personality forward. Not every poet does that, but there's always somebody, and I want you to think about it. And sometimes that voice might not be your own voice. It might be a voice that you've created. It's always fabricated to some degree, but sometimes maybe it's fabricated to the point that you're really creating a persona, that you're making a character who is speaking those lines. We read that Thomas Harding poem earlier in the semester, where Matthew Browning poem early in the semester, in which he focused on creating a character. He did that a lot in his work. Browning spent a lot of time in what we call persona poems now, where he created characters. They weren't him. If somebody in a poem is talking about murdering one of his wives, that's not Browning. Browning seemed to not do that, as far as we know. But he's creating characters that do. This is a place where poetry and fiction maybe merge together a little bit. But think about who your speaker is. And maybe sometimes it's a good activity to create a poem that has a speaker that is very, 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 very different than who you are. And think about how that works and how you are able to navigate that world and what you're able to do with it. The next section is all about rules. And Kuser tells us very specifically to not worry about the rules. And I think that is probably good advice. I'd want to make sure we know some of them. I don't think you are allowed to completely forget about rules until you know a little bit about what they are. And some of your comments, people have said that I like knowing enough of rules to sort of disregard them, or I don't want to necessarily know this. I don't feel like I need to know the specifics of a certain rule or a certain term for meter, but I like knowing what it represents. So this isn't, I'm not going to ask you to memorize a million different terms. I'm asking you to kind of have a basic understanding of what something can do. But as he tells us, don't worry about the rules. And what that means, I think, is that you do what you want to do. You make decisions that are based on what's going to be best for you and for this poem. Because beginning poets often ask first about rules. I think we do, right? Do you always have to capitalize the first word in every line? No, but you can if you want, although I did mention it in class last week. And so on. Well, there are no shoulds or should nots of poetry. You can do whatever you feel like doing, pants on or pants off. Part of the joy of writing or of practicing any art comes from the freedom to choose. This is important. So when I call you out, and I don't feel like I'm calling you out, I think I'm more gentle than that, but if I call you out and I say, hey, why do you have the first line of each poem capitalized? You don't need to do that. You can, maybe you didn't know that. Maybe you had Word writing your poem for you. Word does that, right? Word will automatically capitalize the next line. Don't let Word write your poems. You write your poems. So maybe it was a simple mistake. Maybe you didn't realize. Maybe you didn't think it mattered. Maybe it's conscience. Maybe you know that some of those great poets that you study in other classes, well, they capitalize the beginning of each line. They're making each line their own body. So I want to do it too. Cool. You don't have to. There's no musts. There's no shoulds or should nots, as Kuser tells us. You do what's right. You just try it on, and you see where you go. So I think that it's important to kind of think about what you can or can't do. That being said, there are a lot of rules in poetry, and we're going to spend some time talking about some forms in the Oliver book here in a minute. And those are things that have a lot of rules until they don't, right? We talked about sonnets a little bit. A sonnet should have 14 lines. There should probably be a turn in it. Sometimes it can rhyme. It doesn't have to. I think if you wrote a sonnet that didn't have 14 lines, I'd have a hard time calling it a sonnet. But if you were very passionate, wanted to tell me that, well, heck, maybe I'd go along with it. It's an important thing about poetry. We should know the rules, but we should also be able to break those rules whenever we want. But it doesn't feel like you've earned the right to break rules unless you have a better understanding of what the rules are supposed to be in the first place. So I think that it's important to take his advice of not worrying about the rules. I think you can learn them, but it's important to make sure that you don't have to follow them all the way through. When we talked from the Oliver book about rhyme and meter, yeah, it's pretty structured. And a lot of poets like Frost, they're not breaking from that, man. Frost is not going to have many irregularities, except when he does, because sometimes we do. Sometimes we change things around just a little bit, and we move from having our unstressed and stressed to flipping it. just to hit it a little bit. Does that break the rules? Yeah. Does it matter? No. If it's in the service of the poem, if you set up a series of da-da, 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 da-da's, and then suddenly there's a da-da that happens at the end of a line that punches it a little bit more, and you have that ping-pong type word that's Bondy, that's okay. In fact, it might be great. You can absolutely do that. As he says, continuing in chapter 4, we're on that first page on 35, we're accustomed to rules for just about everything we do. From wearing a hairnet in a restaurant kitchen to the proper way to make pan gravy. Heating the grease to the right temperature and then very carefully folding in the flour with a fork. So it's reasonable that we would expect to have set rules for us when we write poetry, especially since we're taught all the way through middle school and high school that this is so structured. That when I hand a poem to a student who's not in a creative writing class, they get tense. We kind of tense up a little bit because you see a poem and you're like, oh, things are different. There are rules to poems. I have to uncover what I'm doing here. I have to solve this puzzle. This is how we often feel when it comes to poems, but it shouldn't be that way. Poems in some ways are freer than other forms of writing because I can do whatever we want. We talked last week and before about prose poems. Cool, right? Some of you said you didn't like them that much. That's fine too. You don't have to. But that's something that we can do. That's something that has some value for some writers, but we don't have to do it because, hey, that doesn't really feel like a poem. That's okay. So maybe to you a poem has to be something that rhymes and has a certain meter. That's fine too. I want you to not worry about the rules unless you want to. I want you to be able to make the choices that you want to make as we go on, right? If you decide to engage in a certain form, know that if there are opportunities to kind of back out of it, you can do that. Now, as we talked about from discussions in the previous chapter, that sometimes if you set up very, very structured rhyme and iambic pentameter, and then you break out of it in a way that doesn't seem to follow any logical pattern, the reader's going to know and maybe get disoriented by that. But if your goal is to disorient the reader, which sometimes it is, cool. All right, page 38. About third paragraph down. John Berger, the English novelist and critic, says in one of his essays about painting that in the work of a master, the form seems inevitable. And if you look at the successful poets, you can see how right Berger is. Every successful sonnet is a good poem first and a good sonnet second. Let's say that one again, okay? Every successful sonnet is a good poem first and a good sonnet second. The poetry must lead and the form follow, if only a heartbeat behind. Or we might say that the poetry and the form must be perfectly integrated. So think about what he's saying here. That a good poem is a good poem, no matter what it is. If a good sonnet is working successfully, it's because it's a good poem. It isn't because I don't look at a sonnet and think, wow, this sonnet followed every rule. I love it. Do you like the content? Well, no, but it followed every rule. It's beautiful. It's not how it works. You've got to have the poem itself work successfully, and that's what matters. So if you have a good poem and it happens to be a sonnet, good on you. If you have a good poem and it happens to be a free verse, good for you too. That's all right. What matters most is that we write a good poem. And what is a good poem? Well, we've talked about a little bit of this as we've gone on, because that can be subjective, right? What one person might think is a really good poem might not be as engaging to somebody else. But I think a good poem makes me feel something, makes me think something, and maybe what I'm feeling is something deep and emotional. Maybe it's something that is funny. Maybe it's thought-provoking in a way that isn't about the end of the world, but kind of gets me thinking about something. But there are a lot of ways we can measure the quality of a poem. And I think that one of the ways we shouldn't necessarily do it is just based on how well it followed a rule. I want your poems, if you're writing them formally, to be successful formal poems. I really do. But I also want you to make sure that you are writing good poems first and foremost. But we have to talk about form. And Oliver wants us to talk about form. And she talks about it better than anybody I've ever seen. So let's talk a little bit about forms and given forms. And remember, what she's talking about here, does not exist independently from what we just talked about in regard to the cruiser. A good poem is a good poem first. And it can be a good sonnet or a good sestina or a good whatever it is second. But it should be a good poem first. So let's go over to 58 and talk about some given forms. Again, my Mary Oliver book looks like it's getting closer to falling apart every minute. So I got to move quickly before the whole book just collapses, sadly, in my hands. Let's just start where she discusses things on 58. A poem requires a design, a sense of orderliness. Part of our pleasure in the poem is that it is a well-made thing. It gives pleasure through the authority and sweetness of the language used in the way that it is used. Her italics, right? It gives pleasure through the authority and sweetness of the language used in the way that it is used. So it's about the language because of how it is being presented. It isn't necessarily that this in a vacuum, a particular line would mean anything, or the words in a different order would mean something. It's the way the language is used here. So when she's saying design and sense of orderliness, even when a poem is very disorderly, and we'll encounter some of those on occasion, there's still an orderliness to that disorder. It's creating a chaos that still has a structure about it. There are poets that I love. Susan Howe is a wonderful poet. And Susan Howe is a poet who throws words all over the page. And I think in some of her early work, she would literally cut out words from poems and then put them on a page in a way that makes it hard to know how to read, but you can look at these independent parts. Is there a sense of design to that? Of course there is. Is there a sense of orderliness? In a way, the order is in the chaos. We can do that, right? It gives pleasure. Now, the word pleasure is an interesting one because there are poems that I've read that I don't necessarily feel pleasure. I feel maybe a sense of unease or a sense of confusion. But there's still that curiosity that drives me in a good poem when it does that. So I think pleasure kind of works for that too. Right? Even if the poem is a description of unalleviated chaos, she goes on to say, it is a gathering of words and phrases and patterns that have been considered, weighed, and selected. So every word is there for a reason. Perhaps the poem was conceived in raw genius. It was also drawn through the measured strings of the man-made harp of song. So there's reason that's here. Maybe there's a chaotic genius, but no matter what the poem, we can measure it in these ways. In the chosen design, all of the things talked about in the previous chapters are important. Rhyme, meter, length of line, the sounds of the various letters. Other things matter too, including the overall length of the poem, its tone. Is it elevated or is it casual? You'll encounter both of those along the way. If we're talking about a poem in which the language is elevated, what does that mean to you? Does it mean that there are big words? Does it mean there are big, lofty thoughts? Maybe, right? If it's casual, does that mean it sounds like something you could hear somebody saying if you're overhearing a conversation somewhere? Maybe, but it's still probably going to be more structured than that. It's not going to just be what somebody says in sort of a stream of consciousness way, or what somebody says as they are just putting their thoughts together sort of on the fly. But it's still going to capture something more casual, and that's okay. Because there's so many elements in the design of each poem, a pattern may be repeated, but will not, in fact, cause one poem to be more than roughly like another. No two poems are alike, not anywhere in the world, at any time, nor will they ever be. Now, you might think there are poems that are alike. You know, I've read some poems in a certain collection, or some poems here and there, and it feels like there's a lot of things in common with different poems. Well, yeah, that could happen. But you will still have an impetus to a poem that's going to be unique to the poem. You can have elements of the poem that are unique to it. There are a lot of things that can be unique to a poem, and that's okay. She then goes on to talk a little bit about rhyming patterns and what different kinds of rhyming patterns you can encounter in a poem. And a lot of these are probably, for many of you, review if you've had enough literature classes that have discussed poetry. When we're talking about couplets, we have the A, A, B, B, C, C, D, D rhyme scheme. When we are structuring the rhyme in a poem, we will give each end word a letter. The first will be A, the second B, the third C, and so on. And when a rhyme appears that emulates the earlier word, if we have a word that rhymes with another word, then we take the A and we carry it down. So if we have a couplet in which two words are rhyming very directly with each other, we call that the AA. right? Or the BB. That's a couplet. Those are two lines that rhyme very directly with one another. A tercet would be 3 lines in a row that are rhyming with each other. A quatrain, generally we look at that in the AB form, right? Hat, night, cat, fight. Okay, that we'd be kind of playing it out that way. She then introduces the form of the sonnet. Again, it's a poem of 14 lines traditionally. It uses iambic pentameter line, but some poets have written sonnets in tetrameter, some other way that varied the form. It's okay. It's important for us to try different things in poems, and sometimes we fall into our English roots, and sometimes we try the Italian, and sometimes we do it different altogether. She then will talk to us here on page 60 about the stanza. And let's talk about stanzas, because it's hard for us, if we are more used to thinking of things in terms of prose, to call it a paragraph or call it something else, but it's a stanza. And as she defines it, it's a term by which we designate a group of lines in a poem that is separated by an extra amount of space from other groups of lines in the poem, or other stanzas. So when you see a poem that is structured so that, actually I don't know if that's the best example. So if you see an example of a poem in which you have parts that are separated by line breaks, you have a poem that is structured in stanzas. Let's talk about why that's important. Each stanza should be contributing something to the overall poem. Each stanza should be giving us something. I've already said that with lines, right? Every line should be doing something that benefits the poem. You shouldn't have lines that just exist to fill up space. Each stanza should have some sort of dynamic and relationship too. The lines in the stanza should have some reason for being together within a stanza. That does not necessarily mean that it has to be self-contained by punctuation, that a stanza has to end with a period. It doesn't. It can end with a comma that moves into the next stanza. It can end with a line break that moves us into the next stanza. But I think it's fair for us to evaluate each stanza in its own and the way that we're looking at it. As she tells us, on 61 in this first full paragraph, it may be useful when considering the stanza to recall the paragraph. Don't call it a paragraph, but we can recall the paragraph, in which indicates a conclusion of one thought in the beginning of another, a sensible division. That's one way we can see it, right? It doesn't have to be, but it can be, to use her word, sensible. I don't mean that the poet should necessarily use the stanza in this way or this way only, but that the poet might think of the sensible paragraph as a kind of norm, as the iambic pentameter line is a norm in terms of line length expressiveness, from which to feel out the particular divisions that are best for a particular poem. Such divisions might be the natural pauses in the action of what is going on in the poem, or they may be well based on something else. But it's good to give us a breath. One of the reasons why I think some of us were less inclined toward the prose poems than others is they're not giving us breath. And breath is important in poems. We like it. We like the fact that at the end of the line I get to linger on a word before I move on to the next one. When you have a stanza break, you get to linger a little bit longer before you get to the next one. It gives breath. It gives us a time, even if it's not a conscious amount of time or if it's a very small amount of time, it gives us a little bit of time to think about what's going to happen next. And so it's important for us to make sure we can think that. It can be said with certainty that a stanza break will inevitably result in either a felt hesitation or a felt acceleration. Ending a stanza at the end of a sentence strengthens the natural pause that follows any line in any completed sentence. Running a sentence through a final line of one stanza and into the first line of another hastens the tempo, right? Because if I get to the last line of a stanza and I know that the next stanza is coming and there's going to be a break, and I know that because I can see it, I'm really interested when I realize that there is no comma or certainly not a period, that it's moving me forward. I kind of accelerate because I want to see what's next, and I'm not expecting a pause. I'm kind of wondering in my head why I'm getting one. So that is absolutely hastening the tempo, sometimes extraordinarily. Additionally, it can create a feeling of creative power of subject, power of poet, over mere neatness. There's something kind of unexpected, maybe chaotic about it when it happens, and so it's nice to be able to try it and do it. Any change from an established pattern indicates that the poet wants the reader to feel something different at that point. One of the assets of a pattern is this ability to manipulate the reader by breaking it. So this is kind of getting back to what Kuser talked about with rules, that we can break the rules. A stanza can be any form or style or structure that we want, but if we're doing things that are kind of keeping the reader off pace, maybe there's something kind of interesting about that, right? Besides being a guide to the way the poet wants the reader to feel and understand the poem, each stanza is part of the design of the poem, part of its formal order. The stanza is therefore a pleasurable as well as a useful thing. So stanzas are important. Maybe your poem will only have one. Maybe your poem is very, very short, so there isn't really a lot of room to have a lot of stanzas. Stanzas or poems also can be divided into different sections, numbered or not. She gives us the example of the James Wright poem Before a Cashier's Window in a Department Store. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird is another poem famously that is broken into numbered sections, that one by Wallace Stevens. So you can do this on occasion. They have numbered sections. This is something most poets have played around with. Rather, they may travel wherever the particular requirements of the poem lead the poet. So you don't have to number them, but you can. It just doesn't matter. It matters where the particular requirements of the poem lead the poet. It is difficult in the usual single-bodied poem to break away from those two ordinary entities attached to any ongoing narrative, time and place, even though such breaking away to something else may sharpen and deepen the context of the poem. With the use of separate sections, however, the poet may change the landscape, the narrative, the tone of the writing, the length, in fact, anything and everything. That is not to say that the poem does not require its focus in sequential unfolding, but rather that the poet is free to present material with a sort of wheeling complexity, like James Wright does in Before a Cashier's Window in a Department Store, unencumbered by the formality and implicit margins of the more formal poem. And let's read Before a Cashier's Window in a Department Store, and let's see if we can see what she's hitting on. In this poem, we have different numbered sections. You look at them differently, right? You look at them as being more independent of each other. So let's read it and then let's think about it. And I'll read the numbers on each one, which sometimes poets, when they read their own work and it's numbered, they don't do. But in this case, we'll do it to kind of emphasize it a little bit. 1. The beautiful cashier's white face has risen once more behind a young manager's shoulder. They whisper together and stare straight into my face. I feel like grabbing a stray child or a skinny old woman and driving into a cellar, crouching under a stone bridge, praying myself sick till the troops pass. 2. Why should he care? He goes. I slump deeper. In my frayed coat, I am pinned down by debt. He nods, commending my flesh to the pity of the daws of God. 3. Am I dead? And if not, why not? For she sails there, alone, looming in the heaven of the beautiful. She knows the bulldozers will scrape me up after dark behind the officers' club. Behind her terrible blaze, my skeleton glitters out. I am the dark. I am the dark bone I was born to be. 4. Tu Fu woke shuddering on a battlefield once, in the dead of night, and made out the mangled women, sorting the haggard slant eyes. The moon was up. 5. I am hungry. In 2 more days, it will be spring. So this is what it feels like. I'd love to hear your responses to that. And you know, even if you're yelling at this video right now, I can't hear. So make some thoughts about what you feel about this poem and how the numbering is kind of contributing to what's going on overall in the poem and how it's making an overall message come clear. Because if you take those numbers out, then I'm reading this poem much more narratively than I would. And so the poem starts with an image that's pretty specific, and then it gets less and less concerned with images until we get to the end, and nothing is very particularly detailed in terms of that. It's getting at emotional stakes. But maybe the numbering is helping us with that. Maybe it would feel very different if you just read it straight through. The last section that we read for today is about free verse. And free verse is something that is, in the grand scheme of poetry, more recent than we think. In 1855, Walt Whitman gave us Leaves of Grass. And he wrote almost all of his work, as she tells us on page 70, in long, unscannable, usually end-stop lines. And he is frequently cited as the first American poet to write in free verse. It's like calling a mountain a hill. It isn't wrong, but it doesn't tell us anything useful or uninteresting. Whitman's work, colossal, unique, is fairly categorized as free verse now that free verse has been invented, but it wasn't necessarily looked at that way. And I think it's interesting that one of the first poets of note that did this, and what I mean by this is wrote in free verse and kind of knocked a lot of those rules out of the way, didn't worry about structured rhyming, didn't worry about structured meter, was an American, right? Maybe a lot of those old English and Irish poets, maybe they were so attached to the history that they had in the form that they couldn't find their way out of it. That's fair, right? There are poets that were so brilliantly innovated. Poets like Keats and Shelley. And maybe if they had lived into their 30s, maybe they would have gotten more bored with the forms that were presented to them. Obviously, they did pretty remarkable things with what they were given. But we get to Whitman in the mid 1800s, and he, as we think about free verse now, as Oliver notes, is what we kind of think about at this point. It's not necessarily as random and haphazard as we think, and it didn't necessarily mean that after Whitman wrote, everybody was suddenly like, yes, let's get rid of the line, let's get rid of iambs, let's do everything in this sort of haphazard, seeming random way. We didn't do that. Robert Frost, if you recall, comes well after 1850. And he is as structured and brilliant in terms of his forms as any poet ever was. I think I've quoted this to you before, but Frost once told us that writing in free verse was like playing tennis without a net. And I think what he means by that is, what's the point? There's nothing to hold you back. If you're playing tennis without the net, you're just batting a ball back and forth. There's trying to keep it within the lines, but you're taking away a significant challenge. So to Frost, the net was the types of structured form that he was working with. That was what the net was for him. But other poets just didn't do it. And as we've discussed, a lot of the poets that are going to be relevant today in contemporary American and British poetry, and other poets writing in English, they are going to be less concerned with structure and mostly writing in free verse. I think it's important for us to know that free verse is hard. Just because we don't have to think as much about different rhyme structure, different rhythm structure, does not mean that free verse is easy. Far from it. It's very complicated. It's very difficult, because it's always difficult to write something that matters. And that's what you're trying to do no matter what. I think for a lot of writers, it feels freeing to be able to put the word where it needs to be on the page without any real concern for what came before it, except in terms of meaning, I suppose. And so I think that's something that makes free verse such an important draw. I know for a lot of us, especially when we've been raised on so much English and Irish and American poetry that was so dependent on these formal structures, even though we have poets like Whitman, we still have so many poets, even in America, that have more structure than we think. And obviously we know Frost, but we were singing Emily Dickinson because everything is so rhythmically similar that we can do that. And so it's interesting to get your impression on what free verse is. Does it feel like a cop-out? Maybe by 2019, so many decades and near centuries since we came up with the concept of not having to have these formal structures, maybe now we don't see it as a cop-out. Certainly Frost did, right? We listened to Frost. And so I'd love to get your impressions on this, based on some of the things that Oliver has said in her book about free verse and things that you feel overall. What are your impressions of free verse? What are your impressions of formal poems overall? Does it feel like a poem needs to have that structure? Does it not? Why or why not? I'd love to get your responses to this. So please provide some comments and feedback below so I can get a sense of what you're thinking. Now in class next week, I've got a couple poems. We've got Stephen's poem that we did not get to last week that I promised him that I would start with in our workshop as soon as Stephen wants me to do it. We'll do our introductions and our role question first. We won't just jump into it, Stephen. Don't panic. We're not going to just go quite that cold into it. So reread Stephen's poem. Reread it again. Make sure that it's fresh in your mind as you get into it. Don't just assume, hey, that was a really good poem, I'll remember everything about it. Well, it was good, but don't assume you'll remember everything enough to have a conversation. Let's go through it again, maybe a couple times to make sure you've got it. And then I've got one poem that's been given to me, at least one or two that I've got for this week. I'm going to also leave it open. If anybody wants to send me something that you can have together by Thursday, get it to me. It seemed like we had enough time to get everything together. If you got it to me by Thursday, to get things read by Tuesday of the following week, so we have a week for it. And I've been meaning to get something a little more structured. I ended up being out of town this weekend for a conference, and I thought I would have more time to go over some of your work and come up with some things, but I didn't. They really were very demanding at that conference, but it was a good one, so I will forgive them. But let's if you do have any poems that you want to share with me, let me know. I'll try to also put together more of a formal sign-up list so we can get those things together as we go. But I'd love below for you to give me some responses to how you feel about the conversations we've had this week with Kuzer and Oliver and listening to me. What do you think about free verse poems? Does it feel like a cop-out? I trust you, members of the class, to be very upfront about these things. Several of you told me that prose poems weren't really worth it for you. Cool, it's fine with me. And so talk about what you thought about the stuff on given forms that was in Oliver, if you want to talk about that. Maybe you have some thoughts about some of the content from Kuzer of this week. Please put those comments below, and I'll try to contribute and be part of it when I can as well. Anybody has any additional questions about anything, as always, you are more than welcome to come get a hold of me and contact me through email or drop a comment below. But keep up with your writing and your reading, and give me some good feedback so we can have some conversations below that will continue things here. Thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day, everybody.